Hello, the intermission is over. I hope that before this part you had an opportunity to read the last two articles, which includes Better Grading System, Standards-Based Student-Centered Assessment, and then the other one, which is Best Practices for Equity and Grading. This second part of the lecture takes into consideration the thoughts of these. Remember, I'm not going to cover everything, only because it's just too much to cover within these lectures, and I don't want to overwhelm you with extremely long videos or an abundant amount of videos. So this serves at the second part, and I will move through the slides as fast as I can, but it really is your responsibility as a student to read through the content and ensure that you're grasping all the things, and I should be able to see that within your midterm projects, which most of you do a fantastic job at that. So I'm just kind of reiterating some things that I think are of relevance to mention, only because they go into why I do a summary or overview of the readings, and that you can't just depend on the lectures to get all your content information. So again, just like the other one, I will be taking the video part away from the recording, only because of the fact that, well, I'll have the other screen up, and these two readings had a lot of diagrams in them that I thought were important for us to look at. So let's jump on in and continue with the lecture. So the first reading, A Better Grading System, Standards-Based Student-Centered Assessment. I love this reading because I love the charts, and I am a chart lover. I love the charts because they show great examples of how it would really look if you have students self-assess. So this kind of, I thought, was a really good continuance of the idea of what it means to really provide a higher level of reasons for why we assess, and then purposes or assessments that contribute to supporting those reasons. So the last one, remember, we were talking about degrading to degrading, meaning getting out of the superficial reasons, the level one numerical purposes behind grading, and going into the more deeper level feedback and authentic assessments. Now, I do understand that some content areas require heavy numerical assessments, but it doesn't mean that it can't be in a structure that is supportive to a purpose beyond the numbers. So this article kind of gets into that. And it too talks about what researchers say about grading and grades overall. I put the page numbers here. The other one I didn't do such a great job at that, so my apologies. But hopefully through reading through, you'll be able to find the quotes that I've mentioned. The whole entire reading is relevant. I just pick out certain things that should be remembered. Okay, so there are some aspects of teaching that we keep in cages. I thought this was so funny, in hopes they will never escape. We don't share our concerns with our own grading approach or that of a colleagues often. We don't spend time with each other determining the meaning of a C, an A, or discussing what constitutes a 3.5 on a rubric. The day is upon us, however. It's time to talk about grades, grading, and report cards openly, if we haven't before, questioning assumptions, embracing alternatives, and focusing on the purpose of what teaching and learning can be. I chose this quote because I feel it is so true. I'm a old school educator. I have never heard, even in my cooperative learning stages where I did my student teaching, where they talked about grading. And typically people don't talk about what it means between the difference in grades and how they assess things. They may talk about what they're assessing, but they very rarely discuss the quality and the decision of what that actual grade constitutes. So I thought that was a really important point to remember. The next point is that if students are constantly producing and receiving discourse in great volume and variety, and if the teacher is free from immensity to circulate and observe, then good evaluation becomes possible without resorting to special activities that detract from learning and make students hate reading and writing. So I picked that quote out because it moves us into the how do we do this? What does that look like? How do we move from focusing in on standards based to focusing in on the students and the experiences that they have in the class? And it can be done through student-centered assessments, but they have to be strategically designed. And the fact that this class is about differentiating instruction, or differentiating K through 12 assessments, sorry, it does help that most of you already understand that student-centered assessments are supposed to be the intended purpose of creating the authenticity that is lacking from a lot of learning experiences students have. The great thing is that through differentiation, you can achieve the authentic learning experiences that students need and kind of focus less on the numbers and more on the process. And I'm here on page 112. So standards-based grades are not bad. However, reporting students' progress as a number and it only representing a system doesn't really help the student in the learning process. It says here, this system made it possible for students to receive the marking period and semester grades necessary for college transcripts and eligibility for honor roll at the same time that it gave me the flexibility to meet individual students' needs. So I don't want you to think I'm anti-standardized standards-based grades, which is a model for grading. But I'm also going to say that it has its purpose. But within the learning process, it shouldn't be the focus. It shouldn't be the focus of the why the students actually want to come to class, why the students actually focus in on what they're learning. Although we can't do like Moffitt mentioned in the article where we don't give them grades at all, we do have to consider a balance. And there should be a communication between parents and students in that balance. I find it very interesting that most times students and parents are not a part of the process of grading or evaluation, and they need to be because they're the people who count the most in regards to what these numbers actually mean. So one of the things that they said to do is to have explanation of grading system. This I thought was a really cool example. Please note, you will have to develop for the final a version of some kind of communication. So this might be a really good example for you to follow. Figure 1. Figure 1 is a great example. Why? Because it explains the points. It explains the grading system in short and has a memo to communicate to the parents and the students as to what they are agreeing to do. And then, before we move on, so here it says, a standards-based student-centered approach to assessment does not mean the student will never experience a formal exam. It does mean that the essential difference is that the teacher knows the purpose is to provide valuable feedback to students. So getting back to what I was just saying in that you don't take away the numbers because they matter. We all know that students have to take the standardized exams at the end of the year. And they have to take the MAPS assessments and all the other assessments that we've come up with to monitor their progress. But how you use those things and what you do with that information matters in how you design the learning experience based in the assessment aspect of learning. So here, starting off with inviting students into the process and the parents are part of the process, that decreases the overvaluing of the numbers. So traditionally, in a traditional grading model, you give the students the report card, they go home, the parent and the student has a conversation, and that's it. You know, typically the teacher is taken out of that, you administer the grade, and then that's it. And then the student may come back in, and sometimes the parent conference would happen. But in this particular way, where you include the information for students and parents, and then you have the baseline self-assessment, baseline self-evaluation. The parents and the students are invited into the process early on. They become a part of the work in progress evaluation the student does and the teacher and the parent does by the way in which you use self-evaluation. So I'm not, I don't typically use a lot of self-evaluation charts, but I think that they're good to include. I usually do like a survey kind of thing, similar to how I in this class where students get to evaluate how they feel that things are going. But this I think may be really important and pair well with gifted education and other special groups within our classes, within our inclusive settings, because it allows the student to monitor their progress while progressing through their skill base, right? So the focus is more on the skills and less on the grade that they're earning. They do have points, and those points can then translate into a grade, but look at where it goes. It turns it into responsibilities of what the skills that I've earned versus the points that I didn't get. And that parents can be involved in that process. So, before we move on to best practice for equity and grading, because I'm at my 11th minute mark, remember that they have several different models that please make sure you look at. Figure 1, Figure 2, and Figure 3 give great examples of the second parts of what you should be doing for your final. But here you have the alternative to average grades, a sample and anecdotal writing record, which I thought was pretty awesome. So there are other ways. The purpose behind all this is to remember that yes, you have to have numbers and yes, you have to have grades, but what you do with them in regards to your classroom, how you design the assessment, and the value that you place in the number itself can be changed with your simple structure adjustment from standards-based to student-centered assessment. You integrate the standards and the expectations into the things that they need to do to ensure that they're getting what they need without a strong emphasis on the grade that they didn't earn. With that comes best practice for equity and grading. So equity is not a means of saying, hey, I see you there and you need special spelling assignments, so I'm going to give you extra 5 words to remember. And then you'll write the essay. That's not equitable. Equity goes to how do we make it fair for everyone? How do we make it equal for everyone? One of the quotes here that I thought was really important, it says the following traditional approaches to grading. Students receive 1 letter grade per course, which represents the cumulative points they have earned according to their performance on a multitude of assignments and tasks, each of which is weighted differently. A student's academic achievement in a particular course subject is then inferred from his or her grade on the scale. Despite the pervasive use of the points-based system for grading in primary and secondary schools, the quantification of student achievement can oftentimes hinder students' interest in learning, make it difficult to decipher what knowledge and skills students have actually achieved or possess, and then contribute to a teacher bias and expectations in grading. So remember that it's only a letter in secondary settings, and it's unlike elementary settings. You don't have the traditional feedback. We get to say, if their behavior is satisfactory or unsatisfactory, but what does that mean? So these traditional models of grading don't always work for you truly assessing the skills that students have and what they actually learned. So here I wanted to point out some key findings from the article that you probably already knew. The article does discuss the models that are prevalent within most school settings, and it gives a really deep discussion of modifications, how to modify the traditional points-based grading systems, and then it goes into the 5 features of them. It goes into other grading opportunities. I did not get into all that within this lecture, but I do focus on the key findings about grading. So there are 2 main approaches to systematizing grading across the school district. modifying an existing points-based model, or implementing an alternative standards-based grading model, which we saw last week with the two different structures. They had a point scale as opposed to the letter grade numerical values. And then standards-based grading advocates note that it improves student achievement by establishing clear learning targets, accommodating different learning styles, and providing students feedback during the course of instruction. And that to me is like a duh. Only because of the fact that obviously if students are more engaged, the target, right? So if I'm earning 5 points for reading this paragraph and I'm deciphering the context clues, that is a skill that gives me 5 points, or I got 1 out of 3 points, or 5 out of 10 points. That makes sense. I think it's hard for students to grasp what their grades mean because there's nothing that tangible for them to associate the number with what they actually achieve. Some of the other findings include, for either approach, district administrators should collaborate with educators and school personnel in the creation and adoption of new grading policies. In general, administrators should take steps to separate scoring procedures for academic performance from students' effort or progress. And then for districts choosing a standards-based approach, district administrators must then formulate how to communicate student proficiency. That's another thing. Standard-based exams don't communicate what it means to be proficient. I speak for myself. I was so happy when they got rid of the proficiency exams and they went into the end of course exams, which is what I'm used to from the East Coast. When I did my student teaching, we had end of course exams, and also in North Carolina where I taught for the first part of my career, we had end of course exams that actually pointed out what it meant to be proficient. And I find that the proficiency exams here kind of did not have that. So you have students who passed their writing proficiency, but they were like, does this mean I can read or write? What is it? What does it actually mean? And a lot of students were left with the idea that, I passed my test, so now I'm graduating, but that's not really what it means to be proficient. So especially with the subjectivity and how it's graded and who's reading it, and then not being able to read the legibility of the actual writing. It was crazy. So I'm glad they changed that. But some final thoughts on grading. I know it was a lot of content to cover this week in regards to the reading, but just consider for yourself what grades should do and what they should not do. So grades should not reflect behavior norms and highlight assignments that fail to represent the full skill ability of each student, which is sometimes what we see, but grades should provide purposeful learning opportunities that promotes meaningful content discourse. They should represent equitable opportunities for all students to demonstrate their abilities and assess multiple skills that teach essential strengths beyond memorization or testing requirements. Remember, the student should have a skill that they can walk away from saying that they know how to do. And it should be something that's purposeful and something that you see throughout all the assessments. I hope that this summary kind of highlights all the essential things. If it doesn't, go back to the reading as you should do already. And use the discussions that we have this week to ensure that you're gaining all the information that you need. If you have any questions about the readings, feel free to email me. And that concludes the last lecture of this module. Have a great day.